Hello and welcome. This is Lawrence Lang, and I'm here in Buxton for part of the 2024 30th International Gilbert and Sullivan Festival. To talk with me today is Ken Robertson-Scott, who was the penultimate stage manager with the D'Oyly Carte from 1975 until 1980. I suppose a good starting point is how come you joined the D'Oyly Carte? Did you have a previous love of Gilbert and Sullivan, or was it just a work opportunity?
Oh no. Good morning, by the way.
Good morning.
It's nice to be here. It goes back much further than working. I remember when I was at junior school, I went to a local school and saw a school's production of HMS Pinafore, which amused me but didn't really get me. And then as a schoolboy, a few years later, I saw a poster. This was in Sunderland, near my hometown in the northeast of England, for the D'Oyly Carte, and on the Saturday night they were performing the Mikado. And so I took myself off to see this Mikado, which was in the late 60s. And there was the great John Reid, Ken Sanford, Julia Goss, John Aildon, and a man called John Webley, which sadly very few people remember him now. And
I remember John very much. Yeah,
he was a wonderful performer.
Oh yes, he was my first captain and first pistache.
Well,
and,
I think
yes.
I think he was, to me, one of the best Strephons I ever saw, because he looked just the part. I mean, he was fantastic. So I sat there in the dress circle at the Sunderland Empire, and like lots of people, were completely transfixed by this brilliant company. I just absorbed it, and of course, John Reid made the audience feel very special when it came to encores. And I'm doing this for you. I don't do these encores very often, but you're a special audience, so I'm going to push the boat out. Of course, in reality, John did that regularly, but he made that audience feel very, very special. And so that was the hook that grabbed me in. Now, the D'Oyly Carte played the Empire, Sunderland, and the Theatre Royal Newcastle every 2 years. Empire, Sunderland in the spring, and Theatre Royal Newcastle in the autumn. And so I religiously followed them. And when they were in town, I went every night when they were playing different operas, and developed the canon as it is, you know. So I fell in love with all the operas. And my parents had been involved with amateur dramatics, and I, as a young lad at 12, was at 12, I was a stage manager of the local amateurs.
Wow.
So apparently my parents just said, you were just a natural, you just were a stage manager. And I think Peter Riley, who we'll talk about shortly, had a similar sort of upbringing. He had his own little theatre that he built, a model theatre. And so then one time, the local BBC opt-out, Look North, had a feature on D'Oyly Carte. And they did a 10-minute sequence. It obviously was a quiet news day. And they shot a lot of stuff backstage. Well, I saw that. And I can't believe what I did. I rang up the theatre hall and said, could I speak to somebody from the D'Oyly Carte, please? And they said, well, yes, we'll find somebody. And Michael Hayland, the then director of productions, came on the phone and said, yes, this is the D'Oyly, this is the, I always remember Michael saying, yes, this is the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company or something. And I explained who I was and how keen I was, and could I come and possibly visit backstage, thinking, you know, for half an hour before the show. He said, yes, come and spend a day with us.
Wow.
Well, at that time I was working for my father, but that's another long story. And I went to my father and said, can I have tomorrow off, please? And he went, why? I said, well, the D'Oyly Carte have invited me to the Theatre Royal Newcastle. So I toddled along, and it was a double bill. It was Pirates of Penzance and Cox and Box. And when I arrived, they were still busy lighting Pirates. And I'd been to the theatre all since I'd been a child, but never backstage, and seeing the whole workings of the D'Oyly Carte. And then they set up Cox and Box and lit it. And that was the first time I saw this elegant gentleman, beautifully dressed in a blazer, collar and tie, and a pipe, and wandering around the stage knowing exactly what he was doing, and that was Peter Riley. And so Michael Helland was terribly kind. He showed me around and introduced me to various people. And in the end, he said, well, would you like to come and see a show from backstage? Would I? So I that night I was in the wings and watched the whole thing. Anyway, sorry, I go on a lot, so I do apologise.
No, that's really interesting.
And
yes.
So I got to know the stage manager, the resident stage manager at the theatre, a lovely man called George Spencer. And he said, well, are you interested in backstage? I said, oh, yes, very much. He said, well, we have a lot of part-time stagehands who come when we've got big shows in. Would you like to come and be on our list? So the next company that was going in was the Touring Royal Ballet, which eventually became Birmingham Royal Ballet. So I went there and learned how to handle very big bits of flattage, etc. And he said, okay, yeah, you did well. We've got Sadler's Wells Opera in a few weeks' time. Would you like to do that? And I went, yeah, okay. So, and one of their operas, the first week they did Gloriana and Patience, which was quite a famous production. And then the second week, they were doing the Ring Cycle. So on the Sunday morning, we were all a bit tired after doing the Get Out of the previous operas. And we opened the dock doors, and this big lorry full of steel arrived. And George said, you can't park there. We're waiting for Sadler's Wells Opera, so you've got to move your van and lorry and get out of here. And this man said, we are Sadler's Wells Opera. And it was this massive steel set for the Ring Cycle that sat for the entire Ring Cycle. And so over the years, and of course when D'Oyly Carte came in town, there was me every time. And eventually, in 1974, I wrote to Peter, because in the wings and in the evening, there was a wonderful man called James Marsland, who was the assistant producer. And in the evenings, he would not sit out front, which possibly he should have done, to watch the shows to make sure that the chorus and everybody were doing the right thing. But he used to sit in the wings and chat. And of course, Jimmy loved people and we started to chat, etc. And I said, I would love to join. Well, we'll see how it goes. And anyway. So he was kind enough to get me a ticket in 1975 for the 25th of March 1975
yes.
at the Savoy, which of course was the centenary of the opening of the D'Oyly Carte. So I was a very privileged person. And I'd been talking to Peter Riley with the possibility of joining. And at that point, they had a stage manager and a deputy stage manager, so there was no... But he knew of my interest, etc. So in the summer of 76, the stage manager and his deputy both left, which meant that Peter had to go back on the road without an assistant, which I thought was quite unusual. But anyway, and he was in Oxford, and he was called to London for meetings regarding the 76 tour of America. And he said, well, I can't come. I'm on my own. And the management had decided, all right, we can save a salary. But of course, Peter was then stuck. So he wrote to me from Oxford saying, this is an opportunity to join us. So I had an interview in Glasgow at the King's Theatre. And a few weeks later, I joined them at the King's Theatre, Edinburgh.
Wow. On
the 3rd of November, 1975. So that is a long-winded answer to your question.
Well, no. But it's interesting you were talking about sort of going backstage, because I remember it must have been mid-70s. I had a sort of similar desire, and I contacted the company. And when they were playing a week in Eastbourne, Peter Riley met me and took me backstage to show me around the set of Act 1 of Ruddigore. Okay. And the thing that I still remember to these days are the prop fish in the Fisher Ladies baskets. It was a wonderful experience. And
there's an interesting story about those fish. We had a contralto, and she was a lovely lady, yes. And she had this very deep, amazing voice, but her diction was, shall we say, interesting. Mm-hmm. And the fisherwomen at the back, standing on the rostra with the netting and the fish, And when the girls heard a word they understood, they passed a fish along the line. But that's a funny story. But yes, and so joining them, it was my parents lived in a very comfortable, well-heated house, and so the afternoon of the 2nd of November was a Sunday, and I packed this enormous suitcase with far too much clothes, and I was put on the train at Newcastle to go to Edinburgh, and it broke down in Berwick, and they put us on this tatty old bus, and it was lashing down with rain, and I got to the Waverley station at Edinburgh, still raining. I got a taxi and I went up to Morningside where my digs were, and there was this huge granite house with no carpets, just lino floors, no heating, and I was shown up to the top floor. It was a bit like scene from La Boheme, and there I was, and I had to put my overcoat on the bed. And I thought, my God, what have I done? But of course the next morning it was a bright sunny day, and I walked down to the King's Theatre, and the rest is history.
Just picking up on something that you said, you said that you sort of made your way to your digs. The D'Oyly Carte Opera Company was one of these touring companies. They were on the road for 48 weeks a year. How did you find the whole prospect of touring and living out of a suitcase?
I didn't care. I died and gone to heaven, quite frankly. Working for the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, I would have crawled over broken glass. I didn't care the situation. But of course, living out of a suitcase. But you see, everybody in your little group, in the bubble of the D'Oyly Carte, was doing exactly the same. So as far as you were concerned, that was a normal way of life. It was nothing unusual. We were all having to do it. And of course, from Edinburgh, we went down to Newcastle, so I was staying with my parents. What they did, the D'Oyly Carte, was they never organised any accommodation for anybody. And they used to advertise in local newspapers ahead, and people used to write in, and there was also the theatre digs list. And so first timers, it was quite hard. But once you'd been to a town and you knew good digs, once you got the list of where you were going, you'd ring up your favourite digs and book ahead. And so the longer you were in the D'Oyly Carte, the easier that became. And if anybody tried to nick your digs, that was a criminal offence. But it's what we were all doing. It was like in the 70s, if you remember, the political situation and the financial situation was dire, but it didn't matter. We were in this little D'Oyly Carte bubble going round, literally over to America as well, and we weren't part of the real world. We lived this bizarre life. When I look back at it now, I thought, but it is a young person's game, touring. I mean, the thought of touring now would fill me with horror. But in the time, it didn't matter.
Because as the 70s moved on, I believe quite a few of the members eventually got caravans.
Well, there was
this wagon train.
That was earlier. That was the early 70s when they had that. And it was called the D'Oyly Carte Tinkers Club. And it was led by John Reed. But then, just before I joined, the price of petrol shot up.
Oh, yes.
And that killed off the Tinkers Club. But it did have its downside because when we played Sadler's Wells Theatre in London, most of them had to put their caravans at Crystal Palace. So it was a long commute in. But I know the Tinkers Club was very popular, and there are stories, I'm afraid I can't tell you, about the goings-on in caravans. It would make a wonderful carry-on film. But for a while, a lot of people did it, and it was a sensible thing. But then the price of petrol, as I said, went up, and that killed off the Tinkers Club.
Yeah, because at least you'd have your own home comforts around you, which you wouldn't necessarily have. But,
your little home comforts, quoting Salter there, yes.
Yes.
But it was a unique, and of course nobody toured as much as we did. The Royal Ballet Touring Company, as it was then, was the nearest rival to us of being on the road for such a long time. And of course all the theatres knew the D'Oyly Carte, and Peter Riley I mean, was a legend in his time, that every theatre manager, every stage manager and chief electrician knew Peter so well. He had this huge reputation, and being Peter's assistant, you know, I'd follow in his wake, and he had a lovely dog, and the dog, he used to sometimes tour the dog, and that dog would know which dressing room that Peter used to use as his office. So the dog actually knew the dressing rooms more than I did. But of course that was one of the first jobs when we arrived in a town, was dressing room allocation. And that was, if it was a theatre with small amount of dressing rooms, that could be quite awkward, asking senior principals to share. And there were some principals who didn't like sharing and all of that. So that was very political. So when you went to big theatres like the Grand in Leeds and places like that, that had lots of dressing rooms, life was a bit easier.
I remember talking to Michael Hayland about a year ago, and one of the things that he talked about was, I can't remember which theatre it was, but there were virtually 0 dressing rooms, and they ended up having to put porter cabins into the car park to actually use as temporary dressing rooms.
Yeah, it happened a few times. The most annoying one was in Nottingham, in the Theatre Hall of Nottingham, before it was refurbished. And Festival Ballet had been in there the week before, and they'd had porter cabins outside. And when we arrived on Sunday morning, those beautiful porter cabins, temporary accommodation, were being hoisted away and taken away, leaving us and we were as big as Festival Ballet was in those days. And it was so frustrating because they could have just left them another week or so. But that was the old theatre hall before it was redeveloped in the 70s, and they knocked everything from the Pross Arch back over down, and then built a beautiful backstage facility, which was wonderful. And then they built the concert hall on the back of that as well.
In 1981, the film Chariots of Fire came out. I think it's well documented about the errors concerning the D'Oyly Carte that were in the film. But it's a great opportunity to see the likes of Lorraine Daniels and Roberta Morell. But we also get the chance to see someone else. Would you like to tell me about that and your involvement with that film?
It was interesting. It was filmed in 1980. And in the spring of 1980, I decided, I was at the top of the tree. We'd recently come back from Australia and New Zealand, and there was nowhere further for me to go. There was a company manager. Peter Riley was moving in to be the new general manager based in London, and Gordon Mackenzie was becoming the company manager, and he was not going to be retiring for some time. And it was a job that I didn't really want anyway. And I thought, I'm in my mid-20s, I think I need to make a move. And so I told the D'Oyly Carte I was thinking of moving. I said it very quietly. And I applied to the BBC, but that's another story. But in the meantime, Freddie Lloyd rang me and said, I've had this man called Putman on. He's making a film about runners. Albert, that was Albert Truelove, is dealing with a lot of it, but they're wanting to do a scene from the Mikado, and can you speak to him? So it worked out that a lot of Chariots of Fire, which was shot on a shoestring, I mean, they had very little money. They were shooting a lot in Liverpool. The stadium that was supposed to be Paris was actually in Liverpool. And they were filming around the time we were going to play at the Liverpool Empire. And so we checked, and the old theatre, the Royal Court, which was then it was dark but really quite tatty, was empty. So we, at that stage, were playing the Mikado set by Bruno Santini. And I forgive anybody who's listening that liked that set. I detested the Bruno Santini set. It looked like something from the Wild West. It was hideous. I much preferred the old Disley Jones set. And of course that was still in the stores in London. And so we organised for that set to be brought up to Liverpool. And the day before filming, me and a lot of the crew from the Empire went across and put the old Disney Jones set up, Act 1 only. And then the film crew came in with setting up cameras and lighting, etc. And the girls, apart from Yum Yum, who was being played by the actress who was in the film, got made up and dressed at the Empire and then were bussed across to the Royal Court. But Roberta Morel and Lorraine Daniels were remade up to look quite hideous, quite frankly, not good at all. So it was very exciting being involved in the film because none of the Vangelis music had been heard at that stage. So we were setting up this big wide shot, and Jonathan Benson, the assistant producer, came to me and said, "Ken, we're in big trouble." I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Well, for the wide shot, we would never see the orchestra, but the DOP, the director of photography, said, well, we'd see the conductor." Now, our conductor, Fraser Goulding, I believe was in London at the time. Now, I thought that David Mackey was actually commuting, but I found out in Harrogate a few years ago when I was telling this story, he was there. And he said, "No, I was in town." And I went, "Oh, I didn't know that." Anyway, basically, I had my equity card. So it was all to track. Harry Rabinovitz was a wonderful musical director who'd put the track down of girls singing in the 20s style, Three Little Me's, very clipped sound. So all I had to do was stand in the pit and wave my arms about. And so he went, "Will you do it?" I said, yeah, sure. So this costume person came and measured me up. And within 20 minutes, I'm in white tie and tails with a very short haircut, standing in front of an empty orchestra pit. And there's the girls on stage. Well, they were laughing their heads off. And Betty Lloyd-Jones said, "Well, there's a touch of Royston Nash there about you." So I conducted away. And Harry Rabinovitz, after one take, came and said, "Ken, it's Three Little Maids. It's not Last Night at the Proms. Just bring it down a bit." Anyway, to cut this long story short, we had a day of filming, which was great fun. But it was the speed that Hugh Hudson, the director, said, "I want to see footlights. There's no footlights." And the standby chippies and painters and electricians, within 20 minutes, had produced a whole set of footlights. Oh, goodness. But that's what film... Now, in D'Oyly Carte, if we wanted a new bit of scenery, it'd take 6 months. There, in 25 minutes, it was there. And the pressure was enormous. I mean, it was tangible. So months later, the D'Oyly Carte was invited to preview. Of course, I'd left, so I wasn't invited. So I went to the local cinema to see. So my partner and I sat there, and I hear Three Little Maids starting up, and the characters were still in the pub talking about technique, about running. I thought, come on, cut to the theatre. This is my moment. So when we cut to the theatre, they're on a shot of the dress circle. And then they slowly pan round to the wide stage. And there I am for 3.5 seconds. And then it cuts to close-ups and everything. And right at the end, they put a spotlight on the Three Little Maids, which we never had. And she looks up to the box where her future husband is sitting. But that's my one claim to fame on Chariots of Fire.
Well, I know that the film has been played quite a bit recently on terrestrial TV, so I hope that you're still getting your regular payments.
Nothing.
Oh dear.
Nothing. No, we were everybody. The entire company was paid a flat fee, and Jonathan Benson at the end of the day produced this big briefcase, opened it, and it was like a movie. It was just full of money, and everybody came up, signed, and was given the money, and that was it. There was a producer called James Crawford, who's no longer with us, and he would have skinned a rabbit for the... I mean, to be honest, they were so tight on money, and none of them realised what a huge show that was going to be. It was very exciting, and of course, it was a very good moment for me because I went on to my career in the BBC, which was never as intense. I mean, we had tense moments at the BBC, but nothing as intense as a feature film.
No.
You know.
Earlier this morning, before we sat down to have a chat, you sent me through some photographs that you thought might be relevant to include in this. There was one of Windsor, so that is obviously an area that you would like to have a brief discussion about. Would you like to fill me in about Windsor?
Yeah. Well, my side of it, I mean, this is really Peter Riley's story, and I'm on the coattails of Peter because it was his baby, and I know you're going to be talking to Peter. But for what it's worth, I'll give my side.
Yeah, please do.
But it's basically Peter's baby. Peter confidentially told me, I think we were in Wolverhampton at the time, that we were being invited to do a performance before the Queen during Ascot Week to celebrate her Silver Jubilee. And I said, "Oh, you mean a concert version, you know, with people sat in rows and print?" He said, "No, the whole shooting match." I went, "Really?" And James Hansen, who had recently joined the board of the D'Oyly Carte, actually funded the costing of it. Now, Peter Riley, the clever man he was, when ATV filmed, well, actually videoed HMS Pinafore at ATV Studios at Elstree, they built a set for that. And Peter bought that set off ATV and stored it in our South London stores. And so that was the set we used at Windsor. And there was also a small backcloth, which we didn't tour, but was identical to the one we used to tour, which is Victory in Portsmouth. And so he organised that. That was the easy bit. But he then had to organise building a stage. And of course, with all due respect to Peter, he'd never had a situation like this before. In the D'Oyly Carte, you know, we toured, etc., but we didn't have experience outside. And eventually he found a company to build a stage and a cross arch and everything. He also had a company that we used occasionally. They provided the extra electrics when we did Sorcerer, based in Southend, and he brought them in to do the lighting. And so Peter sorted all that out. And the problem was that in Ascot Week, at the beginning of the week, is the Order of the Garter ceremony, and the Waterloo Chamber hosts a big luncheon before they all march down the hill for the ceremony. So Peter couldn't get into the Waterloo Chamber until quite late, and we were using the throne room as a dressing room space. And so the crew came in overnight and started building the scenery. And in one of Roberta Morell's books, there is the timetable that Peter meticulously created about how it was all going to work. So we packed the props up. We were playing Brighton at the time. So on the first bus coming, we had a lot of the props, and some of them were sent up by van. So when we arrived, our carpenter, Paul Godman, had very little to do because the set was already there. John Samet, the property master, put all the props out. And I just set up my prompt corner. I had a very easy ride, but I had to find out where the dressing rooms were. And there was no smoking allowed in those areas, in the staterooms. But there was a staff bar in the lower area, in the lower area below. And so when the main company arrived, I had to announce where the dressing rooms were, and then where you could go and smoke, because there was a lot of very heavy smokers in the D'Oyly Carte in those days. But one of the most fascinating things were there was no washing facilities in the throne room. And so out from the stores came these huge Victorian bowls with jugs of hot water after the performance, all marked VR. And there was a whole team of helpers who used to work at Windsor Castle on big events. And so every member of the company got this huge boil and a jug of hot water to wash in. Fascinating. And during the performance, I looked up, and there were men on the roof of the Waterloo Chamber. And if the Waterloo Chamber got a little bit warm, the Queen could give a nod to somebody. And these men on the roof opened the windows to let air in. But the Queen dined her guests, because there was about 150 people there, dined her guests. So we didn't start till quite late. There was no overture. We did Act 1. We had like 3-minute interval for resetting. There was no entr'acte and there was no encores. So it was high speed Pinafore. And then at the end, senior people only were invited to meet the Queen and the royal family. And no members of the chorus were allowed in there. And a lot of staff from London were invited, and it caused quite a lot of upset. I remember
I can imagine, yes.
Standing backstage with Gordon Mackenzie, who'd been in the company by that stage, like 20 or 30 years. And I was just stage manager, so I wasn't invited either. And there was a lot of bad feeling. If they'd just invited one member of the chorus, I think that would have been nice. But of course they couldn't have everybody. But there was some wonderful stories told. There was one about Jimmy Marsden, who I spoke to about earlier, was a great wag. I mean, he could talk for England, a bit like me, I'm afraid. And he got talking to the Queen Mother, and they were nattering away. Well, there was a moment, various principals have told me this, so as I say, I wasn't there. There was a moment where the Queen moved her handbag and all the members of the royal family started to move away. And the Queen Mother was still chatting, and apparently Prince Andrew was sent to go and get his grandmother. And she said, no, I'm having a lovely chat. So the Queen sort of was getting a bit cross. So the next one, allegedly, was Prince Philip was sent. No good. And in the end, the Queen stomped across and said, Mummy, these people need their supper. Now come along. Now, that story has been told to me by various people, so although I wasn't there, I do believe that was the case. Yeah. And then when the royal family had left, we sat down to a cold collation.
And that must have been quite late.
It was very late, yes. But I mean, we were all starving because we'd had a very long day. Yeah. And then a lot of us were staying in a hotel by Heathrow Airport. Some preferred to go back to Brighton that night, but I was too cream crackered, so I elected to stay in the hotel in just by Heathrow Airport. And the next morning we all made our way back. And that night we played Pinafore again to a much more... They were also at Windsor, it was a very quiet audience. They didn't applaud a lot.
Most of my early shows were at the Theatre Royal in Brighton, so I may well have been in the audience at that second night of Pinafore when you sort of came back to a more public.
I always liked playing the seaside towns. They were more fun. And of course Theatre Royal Brighton was a very special theatre, and a friend of a friend who came to work for me in the BBC worked for a puppet company called Presto Puppets here in Buxton, and he came to work for me on a children's programme, and more recently he was manager at the Theatre Royal Brighton. But it was a cosy theatre to play, and when I first went there, it was the last theatre to actually have a call boy, and there was a man in his 60s, and he literally would look over my shoulder, see who the next people to call. And he would go to the dressing rooms and knock on the door. And so it was going back to Victorian times. And their electrics were, I think interesting is the word, very old-fashioned, in a little box just behind the stage door, behind the prompt corner. And of course it was a hemp house. It didn't have all the counterweight equipment, which most houses have. But it was also very interesting because my in-laws lived in Brighton, and one day we'd been to see them, and the following morning I'm on stage, and all of a sudden I hear my in-laws coming through the auditorium, and I'd said to them, well, if you ever want to pop down and see me, please do, never expecting them to. And so they arrived, and I had to show them round, much to the amusement of my team. But no, it was a nice place to play.
Yeah, I like the Theatre Royal very much. When talking to former members of the D'Oyly Carte, in particular the ones that are performing on stage, they often talk about the things that go wrong. Thinking from a technical point of view, have you had any really drop-dead moments from a technical side when you think...
Well,
you mentioned when we were talking a little while ago, I think, about grey squirrel days and red squirrel days.
Well, that was actually in the GNS Festival when we were in Gettysburg. And so it wasn't D'Oyly Carte, but it was a similar situation. When we were in Gettysburg, we had a lot more amateur companies than we have in the festival here. And so I think we had 10 different amateur groups.
Gosh, yeah.
And the theatre staff in Gettysburg, it was a non-union house, and there was 2 senior people, but the rest were made out of 18-year-old students. And the first year I arrived, they'd never had anything like the GNS Festival. And I'd worked on the festival since the second festival, so I was very familiar with the way the GNS Festival worked and how the Smiths work. And so at 8 o'clock every morning, the company would arrive. Now, they'd already had a lot of information sent to them. And within 10 minutes of them opening their lorries' doors to get their scenery out, I knew if I was going to have a good day or a bad day. And the senior technician and I worked out this thing of, if it was a grey squirrel day, we were in for a day of hell. If it was a red squirrel day, we thought we'd have a nice time. And within 10 minutes of the company arriving, he said, was it grey or red? And I would say, oh, it's going to be grey. And we'd go, oh no. God. Because, it was very intensive, in the morning. Like the festival here, in the morning you're doing all the tech, afternoon dress rehearsal, evening show. And why it was squirrels, because like most of America, all the power is over land, And just before the first festival, there was a squirrel who bit through the main power cable into the theatre, blacked out the theatre, was incinerated, instantly cremated, and so it became a bit of a joke. So that's. But within the D'Oyly Carte, I was very lucky. I had very few major issues. One which I will never forget, and it was a horrible moment. We were in America. Now, in the D'Oyly Carte, prop boxes were painted grey, electrics boxes were painted black, but we never had any electrics in America. We always hide in. And the music was in green boxes, green square boxes. And forgive me, I forget where we were and where we were going, but one of the music boxes had been put in a cupboard that we never used. And when we got to the next town, I think it was David Mackey said, we can't find box. And everything was numbered. So we had a good scout. No, it's not here. So the American props man said, well, I think I put that box in our ring. And of course it was still in the previous town. Now all the music was marked up. So this was a disaster. Fortunately, they found a set of music in that town and we were able to use it. But that was one of the most embarrassing moments I ever had. My predecessor left 2 backcloths. Now, backcloths are 40 feet long and they are wrapped in green tarpaulin and are hoisted when they're not being used. Quite often in theatres, they'll be hoisted to the top of the rig, the grid, above the stage, and one day he didn't check completely, so 2 Black Hoths were left behind. But I was very lucky. I didn't have too many. There was one time when we were touring Mikado with the Peter Goffin composite set. Katisha's entrance, she rushed on, and some of the rostra moved, sending the guards who were behind falling down, and Alan Spencer was one of the guards. His hair and his hat went one way, he went another way, and his spear went another way and ran off stage. So that was not a good moment. In the new Iolanthe, which was also done in 1977, we had a new set by Bruno Sentini, and we had this kamikaze bridge that, of course, the piers all had to march over, and it was this hump, and it was pretty dangerous, and within a very short time we got a new bridge. We had a bridge Mark II, which was flattened out, which made life a lot easier. But you know, we were lucky. I once made the mistake. We used to have a front cloth for Mikado, and one night, instead of taking out the house curtain, which was on one set of buttons, I pressed the wrong button and I took the front cloth out. And the boys on stage, sort of chatting and picking their noses and doing what men's chorus do before a show, thought they were going to be revealed to the audience, but of course the house curtain was still in. So as far as the audience was concerned, there was nothing different. But I gave the boys a bit of a shock when that happened.
Wonderful. I know that at some stages, people like David Mackey, who was the associate conductor, used to appear on stage in some of the extra roles, but then Equity brought in the rules to say that only Equity members could undertake these character roles. Now, you have already said that you held an Equity card. Did this have any impact on you?
Yes, it was one of those great moments. But before I tell that story, embarrassment happened a couple of times in London. Instead of, if there was a change of cast in the provinces, we would announce that over the PA system. So it was just "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, tonight's performance," etc. But in London at Sadler's Wells wouldn't allow that. You had to go in front of the tabs. So the first time I did this, and I was only 21, and I was in my dinner suit, and I went in front of the tabs, and the tabs were opened by the deputy stage manager of Sadler's Wells Theatre, a man called David Gorringe, who I would like to talk about a little bit. And just as I was walking through the tabs, he said, by the way, the tabs are the house curtain, he said, "Your flies are undone." And I went, "Oh, God." Anyway, I got out there and I said, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." And I looked down, and there was the entire orchestra holding up pornographic photographs of young girls to put me off. And apparently it was a tradition that they did. So I made the announcement and went back. So those were a little bit embarrassing, but the worst one was all, and going back to what you're referring to, I had to inherit the role of headsman in Yeoman of the Guard. And I looked a pretty awful sight. I looked like a pregnant bumblebee. I had black tights, pointy shoes, big trousers, and a jerkin and everything, and the mask. And I had to go on I think it was the 12th bell, march on, swing the axe in time with the music, then go crash just before the prisoner comes. Now, I was in D'Oyly Carte responsible for lighting, and stage managers were responsible. We had no electricians at all, so I was responsible for lighting. So I always made sure that my light looked, well, any of the headsman's light were quite good. So this was at the New Theatre, Cardiff, my very last night on tour before we came into Sadler's Wells, which was going to be my final swan song with the D'Oyly Carte. And obviously I was thinking about the wrong things. So I got on stage and I swung the axe, and one of the things Jimmy Marsden had always told me was, when I took over playing the axeman, is make sure you put the axe with a glancing blow away from your knees. Well, for some unknown reason this night, the axe went in, but slipped off the front. And those of you who remember that we were on a rostra, which was about 2 feet off the ground. So the axe skidded off and headed towards the monk, who was being played by Alan Spencer, who did a little jump. But worse than that, when the axe left my hand, I did a little jump, put my hands to my mouth and went, "Oh!" Well, to the ensemble D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, that was it.
Not what a big butch headsman should do.
I know. So the chorus couldn't sing. So The Prisoner Comes was virtually non-existent. The pit there was quite, the string section saw what happened, so they were hardly playing. The only people playing were the brass instruments going boom, 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 boom. So now we've got the situation of, we've got the final tableau to go with, Fairfax and Elsie and me, the only people left on stage. So I thought, right, so I sort of went round and picked the axe up and got it in position. So by which time the chorus, all the men's chorus were lined behind me and were starting to get the thing pulled together. And John Ailton, who was playing Sergeant Bell, came up to me and said, "You silly queen," which set me going again. So, he is not, all that business. So right at the end, as the company left the stage to leave it just with the three of us on stage, they all stopped in the wings and were all arms folded, looking at me to see what. And of course the tabs came in and I just wanted to die. And of course it was one of those great moments. And of course the next morning I went and bought a newspaper just to see if the local press said it. Fortunately, the Cardiff papers were very kind and didn't mention it, but
because it's such a powerful and dramatic moment that
it was just
finale,
yes.
Yes,
and so Roberta put it in her book, and I'm not proud of it, but one of my few footprints in the D'Oyly Carte history is the axeman who dropped the axe.
So you're Andy Warhol, 15 minutes of fame.
Well, one of the curious things about being involved with the festival is, when people talk about GNS, and you mentioned that you're in the D'Oyly Carte, there's so few of us left now, and it's quite fun that, people want to talk to you. It's a bit of an ego trip when you go to the festivals now. But it's sad that a lot of, I'm so grateful for what you're doing, because when we've gone, there's a lot of written word about, and Roberta's books are very nice. And
but it's so much more powerful to actually hear the person speaking about the experiences.
And of course, one of the other major things is that I met my lifetime partner through Gilbert and Sullivan. He was deputy stage manager at Sadler's Wells, and I was Peter's, so I was deputy stage manager of D'Oyly Carte in 1975. And after about 2.5 months, we decided that we might make a go of it. And so we jumped into his car and we put the radio on. And would you believe what was playing was Non Partus.
That's quite a rarity for any GNS to be on the radio.
What it was, yes. And so that became our sort of theme tune. And whenever I went around the world, in Australia or New Zealand or America, and then after I left D'Oyly Carte and left the BBC, I was employed by Houston, Gilbert and Sullivan for 20 years. And whenever we did Iolanthe, it would come to Non Partus. And the other night here in Buxton, and there was a bit of a lump in my throat when it came to it, because sadly I lost my partner last year. And it's quite a moment.
Yeah.
But if it hadn't been for Gilbert and Sullivan, we wouldn't have had 48 glorious years together.
Wow, that's a wonderful thing to be able to look back on, isn't it?
It is.
It's often talked about that the D'Oyly Carte Touring Company was a family, and this is certainly true. That, you know, in people that I've been speaking to, they've still had lifelong friendships with people that they worked with 40, 50 years ago. But I would imagine that there are also sort of families within families, as there are in any sort of normal family, that, you know, you get different subgroups. You know, is there anything that you want to mention about that?
The D'Oyly Carte was an amazing family, and if anybody attacked us from outside, the D'Oyly Carte family came together, and that was formidable. But within the D'Oyly Carte, there was the senior ladies of the ladies' chorus, who were called the Royal Family. And two of them, sadly no longer with us, one was Betty Lloyd-Jones, another one was Anne Eggleston. And they really ruled the roost. I can remember one time we were in Liverpool when I recently joined the company, and Michael Hayland said to me, "Oh, just ask the chorus to bring chairs down from the dressing rooms," which was a completely no-no. But I mean, I was so green at the time, so I put this call out. And the next thing I knew, I had Betty and Eggy sort of saying, "We do not bring chairs from dressing rooms for rehearsals." So the Royal Family, and also on dressing room allocations, you had to be very careful where you put the Royal Family, because they'd all been in the company a very long time, and they would let you know if they were not happy with that. The other group that I sort of belonged to as well was the, and I can talk about it openly now, I couldn't have done it in the 70s, was the gay group, and it was led, I have to say, by the wonderful John Aildon and Meston Reid, Alan Spencer, and quite a few others. And it was in the days where in the outside world it wasn't really acceptable, but within the theatre world it was, and within the D'Oyly Carte it was, of course. And sorry about that motorbike you've just heard, but never mind. That's somebody rushing off to tell the newspapers about what we're talking about now. And so, also, as I was only 21, I was still coming to terms with my own sexuality. And they were a very welcoming group, because as a deputy stage manager, it was quite a lonely position, because you weren't part of the performing company. You were also in really the leader of the tech side, the carpenters and the props man, and of course the wardrobe department. So it was quite a lonely position. So, but socially, I was part of that group, that wonderful gay group, which used to have parties and chats, and we often shared digs. And John Aildon was a wonderful leader of that, and there are many stories that I really can't tell. But it was a happy group, and it was something that, you know, you look now at the world, how the world's changed, and how gay people are now much more accepted than they were then. And so I was very lucky to, when I was growing up, I think at 21 you're still growing up and finding out about yourself. I was very lucky to be part of that group who helped me in lots of ways, learning how to be that way, you know.
Yeah, so it must have been sort of wonderful to have that group of people to give you support and encouragement and accept who you were.
Well, I think it really wasn't said. It was just, I think it was just, you were known as part of that group. And I came out in New York in 76, and of course it was the talk of the company for a couple of days, and then today's news is tomorrow's rubbish, so then it just became norm. But it was the support that was never talked about, but was there, you know. And the sad thing is, we made, when we toured around, a lot of gay men loved Gilbert and Sullivan, and we made friends all over America. But very few of those people who we made friends with in 76 survived the AIDS, because they got all infected before AIDS was known about.
Yes.
And none of them, of those people, survived, sadly. But it was wonderful at my partner's funeral last year that we had quite a contingent of people from the D'Oyly Carte, including what's left of the gay group were there. So that was rather nice. But I consider myself a very fortunate man, to have met a wonderful partner through Gilbert and Sullivan, and also my life in Gilbert and Sullivan, not only with the D'Oyly Carte, but with the festival. And I think I've got to pay tribute to Ian Smith and Neil and Janet and now Ollie, continuing this wonderful thing. And I've had it's been a bit difficult at times coming back to Gilbert and Sullivan, but I have to acknowledge that they are amazing. The tradition of Gilbert and Sullivan has been kept alive and is blossoming.
Definitely, and it is so wonderful that the Smiths have kept Gilbert and Sullivan alive after the demise of the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, and encouraging, I think, the sort of university groups, because they are tomorrow's performers.
Well, last night, for those of you who don't know, after the performance there is a club where the performers of that night's main show put on a cabaret. And last night I was in the club and there was some children about 13 or 14 singing along with some of the songs, and I thought, there's the future, because so few schools now perform Gilbert and Sullivan, which is a tragedy in my opinion. But the festival is keeping, and of course the festival has got its youth production, which I think starts rehearsing today, and that's a wonderful legacy of
definitely
Ian Smith, who started this whole festival off over 30 years ago.
Well, thank you so much, Ken, for spending the last, about an hour and a half or so chatting to me. I don't know how long the edited version will be, but there was some wonderful stuff there which I certainly don't want to lose. So thank you so much for giving me the time today. It's been great to talk to you and hear some of the stories of your time with the D'Oyly Carte and also then with the festival afterwards. And we've still got a busy day ahead of us because we've got the best of Gilbert and Sullivan later on this afternoon with Simon Buttress, and then Pirates of Penzance this evening. So a busy day to look forward to. So again, thank you so much, Ken, for your time. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed, as you said, the last hour and a half, and good luck on the edit.
Thank you.